Daily life in ancient Maya cities unfolded beneath the forest canopy. The classic period of Maya civilization, lasting roughly from 250 to 900 CE, saw the development of sophisticated urban centers deep in the tropical lowlands of what is now southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and parts of Honduras and El Salvador. Most Maya lived in small houses scattered throughout the forest surrounding the ceremonial centers, where massive stone temples and palaces rose above the jungle canopy. Their routines reflected the demands of tropical agriculture, the elaborate religious calendar that structured time, and the social hierarchies that organized Maya society into nobles, priests, craftspeople, farmers, and slaves. The physical environment of the Maya lowlands shaped daily life in fundamental ways. The region consisted of dense tropical forest growing on limestone bedrock, with rainfall concentrated in a wet season that brought torrential downpours and a dry season when water became scarce. The forest itself contained multiple layers of vegetation, from the high canopy where the tallest trees reached toward the sun, to the shadowy understory where smaller plants competed for the limited light that filtered through the leaves above. The air felt heavy with humidity during much of the year, carrying the rich smell of decomposing vegetation, flowering plants, and the various creatures that inhabited the forest. The sounds of the jungle provided a constant background, with bird calls, insect buzzing, and the occasional cry of howler monkeys, creating an auditory landscape quite different from open agricultural regions. Maya houses reflected both the climate and available materials, with most dwellings constructed from poles and thatch that could be replaced as they deteriorated in the humid conditions. The typical house consisted of a rectangular structure with walls made from wooden poles set vertically in the ground and lashed together with vines or cord, the spaces between poles sometimes filled with mud and stone to create more solid walls. The roof was steeply pitched and covered with palm thatch, allowing rain to run off quickly while providing shade from the intense tropical sun. The floor was simply packed earth that became hard through constant use, sometimes covered with a layer of crushed limestone plaster that created a smoother surface. The entire structure sat on a low stone platform that raised it slightly above ground level, providing some protection from flooding during heavy rains and creating a defined boundary for the dwelling. Inside, Maya houses remained relatively dark due to the absence of windows, with light entering primarily through the doorway and gaps in the walls. This darkness helped keep the interior cooler than the outside air, providing relief from the heat during the middle of the day. The furnishings remained minimal, with most families owning little beyond sleeping mats made from woven reeds or plant fibers, a few ceramic vessels for cooking and storage, stone grinding tools for processing corn, and perhaps a wooden chest or basket for storing clothing and other possessions. The hearth, consisting of 3 stones arranged to support cooking vessels over a fire, occupied a central position where smoke rose toward the roof and escaped through the thatch, gradually blackening the underside of the roof materials with accumulated soot. The daily routine in Maya settlements began early, with people rising before dawn to begin the day's activities. The morning air in the forest felt relatively cool, with mist often hanging among the trees and dew coating the vegetation. The sounds of dawn included the calls of birds greeting the day, the rustle of animals moving through the undergrowth, and the voices of people beginning their morning tasks. The smell of wood smoke from cooking fires mixed with the earthy scent of the forest floor and the fragrance of flowers that bloomed throughout the year in the tropical climate. Women lit fires and began preparing the morning meal, while men prepared for the day's work in the fields or other activities, depending on their occupation and social status. Breakfast consisted primarily of corn-based foods, as maize formed the foundation of the Maya diet and held deep cultural and religious significance. The most common preparation involved making tortillas from corn that had been treated with lime water to soften the kernels and make their nutrients more available, then ground on a stone metate using a mano, a cylindrical grinding stone that was pushed back and forth to reduce the softened corn to a fine masa or dough. This grinding work, performed by women, required considerable physical effort and time, the repetitive scraping sound of stone on stone representing one of the characteristic morning sounds in Maya settlements. The masa was then patted into flat cakes and cooked on a ceramic griddle over the fire, creating tortillas that could be eaten plain or used to scoop up beans, vegetables, or other foods. Cacao, the chocolate bean, held special importance in Maya culture, consumed as a beverage by nobles and used as a form of currency throughout society. The drink was prepared by grinding roasted cacao beans and mixing them with water and various flavorings, including chili peppers, creating a bitter, spicy beverage quite different from modern sweetened chocolate drinks. The consumption of cacao occurred during ceremonies and important social occasions, with the drink served in special ceramic vessels that displayed the owner's status through their decoration and quality. The smell of cacao being prepared, roasted beans giving off their characteristic aroma, represented one of the distinctive scents associated with elite Maya households and ceremonial contexts. Agriculture dominated life for most Maya, with corn cultivation following the milpa system of slash-and-burn farming that had sustained populations in the region for centuries. This agricultural method involved cutting down a section of forest during the dry season, allowing the vegetation to dry, then burning it to clear the land and release nutrients from the plant material into the soil. The resulting field would be planted with corn, beans, and squash, growing together in a complementary relationship, the corn stalks providing support for climbing bean plants, while the squash spread across the ground, shading the soil and reducing weed growth. These fields produced good yields for a few years before the soil fertility declined, at which point farmers would abandon them to allow the forest to regenerate and clear new areas for cultivation. The work of clearing forest and preparing fields occurred during the dry season, when the cut vegetation would dry sufficiently to burn. Men worked in groups, using stone axes to fell trees and cut through the thick undergrowth, labor that required considerable strength and endurance in the humid heat. The sound of axes striking wood echoed through the forest as work parties moved through the areas designated for clearing, their voices calling out to coordinate efforts and maintain the rhythm of work. Once the vegetation had dried, fire was set to the field, creating dramatic scenes as flames consumed the dead plant material and smoke rose high above the forest canopy, visible from great distances and marking the agricultural calendar as clearly as any written record. Planting occurred with the arrival of the rains, when farmers used pointed sticks to make holes in the ash-covered soil and dropped several corn kernels into each hole, covering them with soil pushed in with the foot.
This planting proceeded according to rituals and observations that determined the most propitious time to begin, with priests consulting the ritual calendar and making offerings to the deities who controlled rain and agricultural fertility. The farmers themselves made offerings in their fields, placing food and incense at the corners of the plot and appealing to the deities to bless their crops and ensure a good harvest. The smell of burning copal incense, a tree resin sacred to the Maya, accompanied these agricultural rituals, its sweet, pungent smoke believed to carry prayers to the divine realm.
Throughout the growing season, the cornfields required regular attention to remove weeds and protect the developing plants from animals. Men and boys spent time in the milpas, checking on the crops and performing whatever maintenance was needed. The sight of green corn plants growing taller created a visual contrast with the surrounding forest, while the sound of wind moving through the corn leaves added to the ambient noise of the agricultural landscape. As the corn matured, its ears developing and ripening, farmers increased their vigilance to protect the crop from birds, rodents, and other creatures attracted to the food source. The harvest occurred when the corn had matured, typically several months after planting, depending on the variety and growing conditions. The work of harvesting involved pulling the ears from the stalks and carrying them back to the settlement in large baskets woven from plant fibers. Women and children often participated in this harvest work, creating scenes of family activity in the fields as the year's main food source was gathered. The harvested corn was dried in the sun, then stored in special structures raised on poles to protect it from moisture and pests, these granaries representing the household's food security until the next harvest could be brought in. Maya cities consisted of ceremonial centers with massive stone architecture surrounded by residential areas where most people lived in perishable structures that have largely disappeared from the archaeological record. These ceremonial centers featured pyramidal temples rising in stepped tiers toward the sky, palace complexes where rulers and their families lived, ball courts where the ritual ball game was played, and plazas where people gathered for ceremonies and markets. These stone structures were covered with carved decoration and originally painted in brilliant colors, creating visual displays that demonstrated the power and wealth of the ruling dynasty and the importance of the gods to whom the temples were dedicated. The construction of these massive buildings required enormous investments of labor, with workers quarrying stone, transporting heavy blocks, and assembling them without metal tools or wheeled vehicles. Much of this construction labor was provided by farmers during the agricultural off-season, fulfilling obligations to their rulers as part of the complex reciprocal relationships that structured Maya society. The work of construction created scenes of coordinated activity, with teams of workers pulling stone blocks on wooden rollers, masons shaping stones with other stones and placing them in precise positions, and artists carving elaborate decoration into the finished surfaces. The sound of stone working, the thud of hammers, and the scrape of abrasives filled the ceremonial centers during building campaigns. Social hierarchy in Maya society created clear distinctions between nobles who controlled land and political power, commoners who farmed and practiced various crafts, and slaves who occupied the lowest position and performed whatever labor their owners required. The ruling family of each city claimed descent from the gods and performed rituals essential for maintaining cosmic order and ensuring the continued favor of divine powers.
The elaborate ceremonies conducted by rulers and priests occurred in the ceremonial centers, with processions, offerings, bloodletting rituals, and sometimes human sacrifice marking important dates in the religious calendar or significant political events.
Writing presented a crucial technology for recording history, astronomical observations, and religious knowledge, with Maya scribes developing a sophisticated writing system that combined phonetic symbols representing sounds with logograms representing whole words or concepts. These scribes, trained from childhood in the complex art of reading and writing, recorded information on various surfaces, including stone monuments, pottery, and books made from bark paper covered with a thin layer of lime plaster and folded into accordion-like pages. The creation of these written records required specialized knowledge and considerable skill, with scribes holding prestigious positions in Maya society and their work ensuring the preservation of important information across generations. Markets provided opportunities for people to exchange goods and socialize, with regular market days drawing people from surrounding areas to trade agricultural products, crafted items, and various other goods. These markets operated in the plazas of ceremonial centers or in designated areas where vendors displayed their wares on the ground or on low tables. The goods available included corn and other foodstuffs, pottery vessels, stone tools, textiles, jade ornaments, cacao beans used as currency, salt from coastal regions, and various items brought by long-distance traders from distant parts of Mesoamerica. The market created scenes of activity and noise quite different from the quieter pace of agricultural settlements, with vendors calling out their goods and buyers examining items and negotiating prices. The afternoon hours in the tropical forest brought the day's highest temperatures, with the sun beating down on open areas and the humidity making the air feel heavy and oppressive. People sought shade during these hours, reducing their physical activity and waiting for the temperature to moderate before resuming work. Inside houses, the darkness and thick walls provided some relief from the heat, though the air remained warm and still. The sounds of the afternoon included the buzz of insects, bird calls, and the occasional distant rumble of thunder as afternoon storms built up over the forest. These storms a regular feature of the wet season that brought brief but intense downpours. Later in the afternoon, as shadows lengthened and the air began to cool, activities resumed, with families completing necessary tasks before nightfall. Women prepared the evening meal, grinding corn and cooking tortillas, beans, and whatever other foods were available. Men returned from fields or other work locations, while children who had been playing or helping with various tasks gathered near their homes. The sounds of late afternoon included voices in conversation, the scrape of stone on stone as corn was ground, and the various noises of domestic animals being secured or fed. The main meal of the day occurred in the evening when families gathered to share food and conversation. For most Maya, this meal consisted primarily of tortillas, beans flavored with chili peppers, and perhaps squash or other vegetables when in season. Meat appeared only occasionally in the diet of common people, usually from hunted game such as deer, peccary, or various birds, or from domesticated turkeys and dogs that were raised for food. The meal was eaten while sitting on the ground or on low stools, with tortillas serving as both food and utensil, pieces torn off and used to scoop up beans and other foods. The consumption of food occurred with some formality, with prayers of thanksgiving to the gods who provided sustenance and recognition of the sacred nature of corn, the substance believed to form the very flesh of humanity.
Religious observance permeated Maya life, with numerous gods and goddesses worshipped, and a complex calendar system structuring time into interlocking cycles that determined when ceremonies should occur and what activities were propitious on any given day. The ritual calendar of 260 days combined with the solar calendar of 365 days to create larger cycles, and priests maintained elaborate astronomical observations to track the movements of Venus and other celestial bodies whose positions held religious and astrological significance. Common people participated in religious activities through attendance at public ceremonies, offerings at household shrines, and following prohibitions and requirements relating to sacred days and religious practices. As darkness fell over the forest, the sounds of the jungle changed from day-active creatures to those that emerged at night. The calls of night birds, the chirping of crickets and other insects, and the occasional roar of a jaguar created a nighttime soundscape quite different from the daytime environment. Maya settlements became quiet as people remained in their homes, as travel after dark was difficult and potentially dangerous in the forest. Small fires provided light, their flames flickering and creating moving shadows on the walls, while also producing smoke that helped keep insects at bay. The smell of wood smoke and the various odors of cooking, people, and animals created the characteristic scent of nighttime in Maya dwellings. Stories might be shared during these evening hours, with elders recounting myths about the gods, tales of ancestral heroes, or memories of past events that helped preserve cultural knowledge and maintain connections between generations. These oral traditions complemented the written records maintained by scribes, providing everyone with access to cultural knowledge regardless of literacy. The telling of stories created social bonds and helped pass the time during the long tropical nights when darkness made most activities impractical. Sleep eventually came to most people as the night deepened, with families arranging themselves on sleeping mats spread on the floor or on low platforms, covered by cotton blankets if the night was cool, or simply lying in the warm air during hotter periods. Dreams during these sleeping hours might be remembered and discussed, as dreams were sometimes interpreted as communications from the gods or ancestors, messages that might require consultation with priests or specialists in dream interpretation. The cycle of waking and sleeping, like the agricultural cycle and the movements of celestial bodies, represented one of the fundamental rhythms that structured human existence in the Maya world. This pattern of daily life in classic period Maya cities continued for centuries, creating a framework of existence that supported a sophisticated civilization in the challenging environment of the tropical forest. The agricultural base allowed the development of specialized craft production, long-distance trade, elaborate religious practices, astronomical observations, writing and record-keeping, and monumental architecture, all made possible by the surplus food generated through intensive corn cultivation. Individual lives unfolded within this larger cultural context, each person occupying a specific place in the social hierarchy and participating in the collective activities that sustained Maya civilization. This simple, steady pattern of daily existence among the ancient Maya was an ordinary reality for the people who called these jungle cities their home.
Daily life in colonial America followed rhythms determined by agricultural necessity and religious observance. The 18th century saw established settlements along the eastern seaboard, with families working small farms and living in close-knit communities organized around churches and local governance. Most colonists traced their origins to England and other parts of Europe, bringing cultural traditions that adapted to conditions in the New World while maintaining connections to their ancestral homelands. The routines of colonial life reflected both the practical demands of frontier farming and the social structures that European settlers had transplanted across the Atlantic, modified by the specific circumstances of building new lives in a land quite different from the one they had left. The physical environment of the colonies varied considerably from the rocky soil and cold winters of New England to the milder climate and longer growing season of the southern regions, but most settlements shared certain characteristics. The landscape showed the effects of ongoing clearing, with forests being cut back to create fields for agriculture and provide timber for construction and fuel. Stumps dotted recently cleared land, too difficult to remove completely, so farmers simply planted between them until the wood rotted enough to allow extraction. The air carried the smell of wood smoke from countless fires used for cooking and heating, mixed with the earthy scent of turned soil and the various odors of domestic animals that were essential to colonial households. Houses in colonial America reflected both European building traditions and the materials available in the New World. Most dwellings were constructed from wood, which was abundant and relatively easy to work compared to the stone commonly used in Europe. The typical colonial house consisted of a wooden frame supporting walls made from horizontal boards or vertical planks, with spaces between timbers sometimes filled with brick or daub for additional insulation. The roof was covered with wooden shingles split from logs, these overlapping pieces creating a surface that shed rain while remaining relatively easy to repair or replace. The house usually included a large central chimney built from fieldstone and clay, providing a fireplace for cooking and heating the main room, with additional fireplaces serving other rooms in larger houses. The interior of colonial homes remained relatively dark due to the small size and limited number of windows, as glass was expensive and large openings would allow precious heat to escape during winter. The windows that existed consisted of small panes held in place by wooden frames, sometimes covered with oiled paper or cloth rather than glass in the poorest households. The main room, often called the hall or keeping room, served multiple functions as the center of domestic life, containing the large fireplace where cooking occurred, a table for meals and work, benches or chairs for sitting, and various tools and implements needed for daily tasks. Additional rooms might include a parlor for receiving guests in wealthier homes, chambers for sleeping, and perhaps a buttery or pantry for storing food. The furnishings in colonial homes reflected both necessity and the family's economic circumstances. Most households owned a sturdy wooden table, chairs or benches, storage chests, and beds consisting of wooden frames supporting rope or leather straps that held straw or feather mattresses. Wealthier families might own more elaborate furniture, including upholstered chairs, clocks, mirrors, and decorative items, but even prosperous colonists maintained relatively simple domestic environments compared to their European counterparts of similar social standing. The overall impression inside most colonial homes was one of functionality, with items chosen for their usefulness rather than purely decorative purposes. The daily routine in colonial settlements began before dawn, particularly during the growing season, when daylight hours needed to be used fully for agricultural work.
People rose from their beds and began the day's tasks, with women lighting fires in the cold ashes of the previous evening's hearth, and men heading out to tend animals or begin field work. The morning air in different seasons brought varied sensations, from the crisp cold of New England winter mornings to the humid warmth of southern summers, but the routine of rising early remained constant regardless of weather. The sounds of morning included the calls of roosters, the lowing of cattle, the voices of family members beginning their work, and the crackle of fires being coaxed to life. Breakfast consisted of simple, hearty food designed to provide energy for the physical labor that filled colonial days. Cornmeal mush or porridge represented a common morning meal made by boiling ground corn in water or milk until it reached the desired consistency. This might be eaten with molasses or maple syrup when available, providing sweetness and additional calories. Bread, when available, would be consumed with butter or cheese, while families with laying hens might enjoy eggs cooked in various ways. Cider served as a common beverage, consumed by adults and children alike, as the fermentation process made it safer than drinking water from wells or streams that might be contaminated. Agricultural life dominated in colonial America, with most families operating small farms that produced food for household consumption and perhaps a small surplus for sale or trade. The crops grown varied by region, with New England farmers cultivating corn, wheat, and various vegetables, while tending small orchards and keeping livestock. Middle colony farmers produced wheat in quantities that earned the region the designation of breadbasket, while southern colonists grew tobacco, rice, and indigo as cash crops alongside food for their own use. The specific work required changed with the seasons, following an annual cycle that structured time and determined when various tasks needed to be accomplished. Spring brought the work of preparing fields for planting, with farmers using plows pulled by oxen or horses to break up soil that had been left fallow over winter, or to turn under the stubble from the previous year's crop. The plow itself was a relatively simple wooden implement with an iron blade, requiring skill to guide properly and maintain the correct depth and furrow spacing. The sounds of plows moving through fields, the creak of wooden frames, and the calls of farmers directing their animals marked the beginning of the agricultural year. Once the soil was prepared, planting occurred by hand, with farmers walking through fields and dropping seeds into furrows or holes, then covering them with soil using hoes or rakes. Throughout the growing season, crops required regular attention to remove weeds that competed with desired plants for nutrients, water, and space. This weeding work proceeded by hand or with simple tools, with entire families participating in the labor-intensive task of keeping fields clear. The summer months brought long days of work under the sun, with brief breaks for meals and rest during the hottest hours. The sight of green crops growing in neat rows, the sound of wind moving through corn or wheat fields, and the smell of earth and growing plants created the sensory landscape of the agricultural season.
The harvest in late summer and autumn represented the culmination of the year's agricultural work, the time when the success or failure of farming efforts became clear. Grain crops were cut with sickles or scythes, the cut stalks gathered into bundles and shocked in the fields to dry before being transported to barns for storage.
The work of harvesting required all available labor, with neighbors often helping each other in mutual assistance that would be repaid when their own harvest needed gathering. The sound of many sickles or scythes cutting through dry stalks, the voices of workers calling to each other, and the general bustle of harvest activity created scenes quite different from the quieter pace of other seasons. Women in colonial households bore responsibility for a wide range of essential tasks beyond childcare and food preparation. The production of textiles consumed enormous amounts of time, with women processing raw wool or flax into thread through the laborious process of cleaning, carding, and spinning, then weaving this thread into cloth on home looms. The sound of the spinning wheel's hum and the rhythmic clack of the loom represented familiar background noises in colonial homes, continuing throughout the day as women worked to produce the fabric needed for clothing, bedding, and other household uses. Sewing and mending occupied additional hours, as every piece of cloth represented significant investment of labor and could not be casually discarded when worn. Food preservation required careful attention and considerable work, as colonial families needed to store enough food during the harvest season to last through the winter months when little fresh food would be available. Various preservation methods were employed, depending on the food and available resources. Vegetables might be stored in root cellars, underground chambers where the constant cool temperature prevented spoilage for several months. Meat was preserved through salting or smoking, with pork from pigs slaughtered in late autumn being cut into pieces, rubbed with salt, and either packed in barrels or hung in smokehouses, where smoldering fires slowly cured the meat and gave it the characteristic flavor associated with smoked pork. Fruits were dried or made into preserves, while excess milk was transformed into butter or cheese that could be stored. The preparation of meals represented daily work that required planning, skill, and considerable physical effort. Cooking occurred in the large fireplace, with pots hanging from hooks or cranes that allowed them to be positioned at different heights above the fire. The management of the fire itself required constant attention to maintain the right temperature for different cooking tasks, with experience teaching cooks how to read the fire and adjust it as needed. The smell of cooking food filled colonial homes throughout the day, with the aroma varying depending on what was being prepared, but always including the underlying scent of wood smoke that permeated everything in households where fire provided both heat and cooking capability. Children in colonial families participated in household and agricultural work from an early age, learning the skills they would need as adults through observation and practice. Boys worked alongside their fathers in the fields, gradually taking on more responsibility and difficult tasks as they grew stronger and more capable. Girls learned domestic skills from their mothers and other women in the household, practicing spinning, weaving, cooking, and the many other tasks that would fill their days after marriage. Formal education remained limited, particularly in rural areas, though some children learned basic reading and writing either from parents or in small schools operated by local communities or churches. Religion played a central role in colonial life, with church attendance and observance of the Sabbath representing important social obligations as well as spiritual practices. Sunday was set aside as a day of rest and worship, with families traveling to meeting houses or churches for services that might last several hours. These gatherings served social functions as well as religious ones, providing opportunities for communities to come together, exchange news, and conduct informal business. The meeting house or church building also served as a venue for town meetings where local governance occurred, with male property owners gathering to discuss community affairs and make decisions about matters affecting the settlement. The afternoon hours in colonial settlements saw continued work, though the pace might slow during the hottest part of summer days when the sun's intensity made sustained exertion uncomfortable. People sought shade when possible, taking brief rests before resuming their tasks. The sounds of the afternoon varied depending on the season and the work being done, but generally included the voices of people at work, the sounds of tools being used, and the various noises of domestic animals going about their activities. In workshops and homes, craftspeople pursued their trades, producing the various goods needed for colonial life that could not be made in every household. Markets and trade connected colonial settlements to each other and to the wider Atlantic world, with farmers bringing surplus produce to towns where it could be sold or traded for goods they could not produce themselves. These market towns served as economic centers where merchants accumulated goods for export while distributing imported items and local products to rural customers. The arrival of ships from Europe brought manufactured goods, luxury items, and news from the Old World, creating occasions for commercial activity and social gathering. The smell of salt air in port towns mixed with the various odors of commerce, while the sight of ships at anchor and the sound of maritime activity created an urban atmosphere quite different from rural settlements. Later in the afternoon, as the day's main work drew toward completion, activities shifted toward preparing for evening. Women began cooking the main meal of the day, while men finished final chores and children completed their assigned tasks. The quality of light changed as the sun descended, becoming softer and warmer, giving the wooden buildings and surrounding landscape a golden glow. The sounds of late afternoon included voices calling family members to gather, the clatter of cooking preparations, and the various noises of a community transitioning from work to rest. The evening meal brought families together around the table to share food and conversation. For most colonial families, this meal consisted of simple fare that varied by season, but generally included bread, some form of meat or fish when available, vegetables, and perhaps pudding or pie. The meal was eaten from wooden or pewter plates, using spoons and knives, with forks being rare until later in the colonial period. The consumption of food occurred with prayers of thanksgiving, reflecting the religious values that permeated colonial life and the recognition that successful harvests came through divine providence as much as human labor.
Evening hours after the meal passed in various ways depending on the season and family circumstances. During winter, when darkness came early and cold weather made outdoor activity unpleasant, families gathered near the fire for warmth and light, engaging in quiet work such as mending, wood carving, or other tasks that could be accomplished by firelight. Stories might be shared, with elders recounting memories or teaching moral lessons through tales and examples. Reading occurred in literate households, particularly reading from the Bible, which many families owned even when they possessed few other books. The flickering firelight created a warm atmosphere that contrasted with the darkness and cold outside. As night fell, colonial settlements became quiet and dark, with families remaining in their homes and only the most necessary travel occurring after sunset.
Candles or oil lamps provided illumination when needed, though these sources of light were used sparingly due to the effort and expense involved in producing them. Tallow candles made from rendered animal fat gave off a distinctive smell as they burned, while producing light that seemed dim and flickering compared to modern electric lighting. The process of preparing for sleep involved banking the fire so it would maintain some heat through the night while not burning too vigorously, arranging bedding, and settling into bed for the rest that would prepare family members for another day of work. The night brought different sounds and sensations depending on the season and weather. Winter nights felt intensely cold despite the fire, requiring multiple blankets and the body heat of family members sleeping together for warmth. Summer nights offered relief from daytime heat, but brought mosquitoes and other insects that made sleep difficult without some protection. The sounds of night included the calls of owls and other nocturnal creatures, the occasional barking of dogs, and the creaking of the house as temperature changes caused the wood to expand and contract. The sky on clear nights displayed the stars with exceptional brightness, these celestial lights providing the only illumination in the darkness of the colonial countryside. Eventually, sleep came to most colonists as the night deepened, their bodies tired from the day's physical labor. Dreams during these sleeping hours might be remembered and discussed, particularly if they seemed significant or unique, as dreams were sometimes interpreted as divine messages or warnings that required attention. The cycle of waking and sleeping, like the cycle of seasons and the rhythm of agricultural work, represented one of the fundamental patterns that structured existence in colonial America. This simple, steady pattern of daily life in 18th-century colonial settlements was an ordinary reality for the people who called these communities their home.
Daily life on the American frontier followed patterns shaped by isolation and self-reliance. The 19th century saw waves of settlers moving westward across the continent, seeking land and opportunity in territories that had recently been opened for settlement. Most frontier families established homesteads on the prairie or in forested regions, building homes from local materials and working to create farms that could support them in a landscape far from established communities and commercial centers. The routines of frontier life reflected both the practical demands of building a new life in a challenging environment and the cultural traditions that settlers brought with them from the eastern states or from Europe. The physical environment of the frontier varied considerably depending on location, from the tall grass prairies of the Great Plains to the forested regions of the Pacific Northwest, but all frontier areas shared the characteristic of being recently settled by people of European descent. The landscape showed the effects of ongoing transformation, with native grasslands being plowed for agriculture, forests being cleared for fields and pastures, and the displacement of indigenous peoples who had lived in these regions for countless generations. The air on the open prairie carried the scent of grass and wildflowers, while forested areas smelled of pine or hardwood and the earthy odor of leaf litter. The sky seemed enormous in the open landscape, unobstructed by trees or buildings, creating a sense of both possibility and vulnerability. Houses on the frontier reflected the materials available in each region and the skills and resources of the settlers who built them.
On the treeless prairie, where timber had to be hauled from distant locations at considerable expense, many settlers built their first homes from sod, cutting blocks of prairie turf and stacking them like bricks to create walls. These sod houses, often built partially underground for additional insulation, provided shelter from the extreme temperature variations of the plains, staying relatively cool in summer and retaining heat in winter. The roof typically consisted of layers of sod supported by whatever timber could be obtained, creating a living roof that sprouted grass and wildflowers in the spring. The interior of a sod house remained dark and somewhat damp, with dirt floors and walls that occasionally shed soil when the structure settled or during heavy rains. In forested regions, settlers built log cabins from trees cut on their own land, notching the logs at the corners to create interlocking walls that required minimal additional fastening. The spaces between logs were chinked with mud, moss, or wood chips to prevent drafts, though these chinking materials required regular maintenance and replacement. The roof was typically made from split wooden shingles, and a stone chimney provided a fireplace for cooking and heating. The overall impression inside frontier homes was one of Spartan functionality, with few possessions beyond absolute necessities and little space for storage or comfort.
The daily routine on frontier homesteads began at dawn or before, as the work of establishing and maintaining a farm required long hours of physical labor. People rose from their beds and immediately began the day's tasks, with men heading out to tend livestock or begin field work, while women lit fires and prepared breakfast. The morning air on the prairie brought different sensations depending on the season, from the bitter cold of winter when temperatures could drop far below freezing, to the fresh coolness of spring mornings or the already warm air of summer. The sounds of morning on the frontier included the calls of birds, the lowing of cattle if the family owned any, and the voices of family members beginning their work in relative isolation from neighbors who might live several miles away. Breakfast on the frontier consisted of whatever food was available, typically simple fare that could be prepared quickly. Cornmeal mush or porridge represented a common morning meal, along with bread if flour was available and the family had time for baking. Salt pork, a preserved meat that could be stored for extended periods, might be fried to provide protein and fat. Coffee, when available, was consumed eagerly, as it provided a stimulant and a taste of the comforts that frontier life often lacked. The preparation of meals required careful management of limited supplies, as trips to the nearest town for provisions might occur only a few times per year, and families needed to make their stores last between these supply runs. Breaking prairie sod for the first time required enormous physical effort, as the thick mat of grass roots held the soil together in a dense mass that resisted the plow. Teams of oxen or horses, sometimes as many as 4 or 6 animals, pulled special breaking plows with heavy blades through the virgin prairie, the sound of roots tearing and soil being turned creating a distinctive noise that marked the transformation of grassland to farmland. The newly broken ground appeared dark and rich, quite different from the depleted soils of eastern farms, and this fertility attracted settlers willing to endure the hardships of frontier life for the prospect of productive land. After the initial breaking, subsequent plowing remained difficult but manageable, as the destroyed root system no longer provided the same resistance.
The crops grown on frontier farms varied by region and the settlers' origins, though wheat became particularly important on the prairies, where the climate and soil proved ideal for its cultivation. Corn also featured prominently, as it was relatively easy to grow and could be used for human food, animal feed, or distilled into whiskey that served as both a beverage and a form of currency in regions where actual money remained scarce. Vegetable gardens near the house provided variety in the diet, with families growing potatoes, beans, squash, and other crops that could be stored for winter use. The work of planting, tending, and harvesting these crops followed seasonal rhythms, with spring and fall representing particularly busy times, when the success of the entire year depended on completing essential tasks within narrow windows of optimal conditions. Water represented a constant concern on the frontier, as reliable sources were not always available near homestead sites. Wells had to be dug, often to considerable depths, and the water drawn up by hand in buckets attached to ropes, work that consumed significant time and energy. In some regions, particularly on the high plains, water lay deep underground and required windmills to pump it to the surface, these structures becoming iconic features of the frontier landscape. The sound of a windmill creaking as it turned in the wind and the splash of water being pumped represented familiar elements of homesteads fortunate enough to have this technology. Families without wells hauled water from streams or springs, carrying it in barrels or buckets for household use and for watering livestock and gardens.
Women on the frontier carried enormous workloads, managing households while also participating in agricultural labor during busy seasons. The production of food through gardening, processing wild plants and animals, and preserving harvest surpluses required constant attention and considerable skill. Laundry represented a particularly arduous task, requiring heating large quantities of water, scrubbing clothes on washboards with homemade soap, rinsing, wringing, and hanging items to dry. The entire process might consume an entire day's work, and clothes were worn repeatedly between washings to reduce the frequency of this labor. The smell of lye soap and wet clothes drying in the sun or near the fire became familiar elements of wash day on frontier homesteads. Children on the frontier participated in household and agricultural work from an early age, as families needed all available labor to accomplish the work necessary for survival. Boys helped with plowing, planting, tending livestock, and hunting, gradually taking on more responsibility as they grew stronger and more skilled. Girls learned domestic skills, including cooking, sewing, gardening, and childcare, preparing for their future roles as wives and mothers. Formal education remained limited or non-existent in many frontier areas, as the dispersed population made establishing schools difficult, and families often could not spare children from work even when schools existed. Some children learned basic reading and writing from parents, but many frontier settlers remained illiterate. Women on the frontier carried enormous workloads, managing households while also participating in agricultural labor during busy seasons. The production of food through gardening, processing wild plants and animals, and preserving harvest surpluses required constant attention and considerable skill. Laundry represented a particularly arduous task, requiring heating large quantities of water, scrubbing clothes on washboards with homemade soap, rinsing, wringing, and hanging items to dry. The entire process might consume an entire day's work, and clothes were worn repeatedly between washings to reduce the frequency of this labor. The smell of lye soap and wet clothes drying in the sun or near the fire became familiar elements of wash day on frontier homesteads. Children on the frontier participated in household and agricultural work from an early age, as families needed all available labor to accomplish the work necessary for survival. Boys helped with plowing, planting, tending livestock, and hunting, gradually taking on more responsibility as they grew stronger and more skilled. Girls learned domestic skills, including cooking, sewing, gardening, and childcare, preparing for their future roles as wives and mothers. Formal education remained limited or non-existent in many frontier areas, as the dispersed population made establishing schools difficult, and families often could not spare children from work even when schools existed. Some children learned basic reading and writing from parents, but many frontier settlers remained illiterate or barely literate throughout their lives. Hunting and gathering supplemented agricultural production, providing meat, furs, and various wild plants that added variety and important nutrients to frontier diets. Men hunted deer, elk, wild turkeys, prairie chickens, and other game animals, using rifles that also served for protection against predators and, in some regions, for conflicts with Native Americans whose lands were being taken by settlers. The successful hunting expedition provided not only meat, but also hides that could be tanned and used for clothing, bedding, or trade. Women gathered wild berries, nuts, and edible plants, knowledge of which species were safe and nutritious being passed down through families or learned from Native American women in regions where such contact occurred peacefully. Isolation represented one of the most challenging aspects of frontier life, as homesteads might be separated by miles from the nearest neighbors and many miles from any town or commercial center. This isolation meant that families relied almost entirely on themselves for entertainment, social interaction, and dealing with emergencies. When neighbors did gather for barn raisings, harvest help, or social occasions, these events became memorable breaks from the routine isolation of daily life. The cooperation required for major tasks like building or moving heavy loads created bonds between frontier families and established social networks that provided mutual support in a challenging environment. The afternoon hours on frontier homesteads saw continued work, with specific tasks varying by season and the most pressing needs. Summer afternoons might find people in the fields cultivating crops, cutting and hauling hay for winter livestock feed, or repairing fencing and equipment. Winter afternoons might be spent in the barn caring for animals, repairing tools, or in the house engaged in various crafts and maintenance work. The sounds of the afternoon varied considerably from the relative quiet of winter, when snow dampened sound and limited outdoor activity, to the buzzing activity of summer, when every daylight hour needed to be used productively.
The arrival of the railroad transformed frontier life in regions where rail lines were built, connecting previously isolated areas to markets and sources of manufactured goods. Towns sprang up along the rail lines, providing commercial centers where farmers could sell their produce and purchase items they could not make themselves.
The sound of a train whistle in the distance became a symbol of connection to the wider world, even as it marked the end of the most isolated phase of frontier existence. The railroad also brought more settlers, increasing population density and beginning the transition from frontier to settled agricultural region. Later in the afternoon, as the day's main work drew toward completion, activities shifted toward preparing for the evening. Animals needed to be fed and secured for the night, as predators, including wolves, coyotes, and mountain lions, might attack livestock left unprotected. The evening milking of cows, if the family owned dairy animals, provided fresh milk that would be consumed immediately or processed into butter or cheese. The quality of light changed as the sun descended toward the horizon, the vast sky displaying spectacular colors that were among the few aesthetic pleasures regularly available to frontier families whose lives focused primarily on survival and economic security. The evening meal brought families together after a day of largely separate activities, men having been in distant fields while women worked near the house. The meal consisted of whatever food was available, with variety limited by the season and the success of agricultural efforts. Bread or cornbread, beans, salt pork, or fresh meat if available, and vegetables from the garden or from preserved stores represented typical fare. The meal was consumed with little ceremony, though families often observed a moment of prayer or thanksgiving before eating. The conversation during meals covered practical matters, plans for the next day's work, and discussion of whatever news might have been learned from passing travelers or letters from family members still living in the East. Evening hours after the meal passed quietly, as frontier families had little access to entertainment or diversions beyond what they could create themselves. Reading occurred in literate households that owned books, though the limited light from candles or oil lamps made extended reading difficult. Music provided entertainment in some families, with simple instruments like fiddles, harmonicas, or banjos being played, the sounds carrying across the prairie on quiet evenings. Stories might be shared, with elders recounting memories of earlier times or tales heard from others, these oral traditions preserving family and cultural history in the absence of written records. Children played simple games or listened to adult conversation, gradually growing tired as the day's activities took their toll.
As night fell over the frontier, the darkness became absolute in the absence of any artificial lighting beyond that produced by individual homesteads. The stars shone with exceptional brightness, the Milky Way clearly visible as a broad band of light across the sky. The night sounds on the prairie included the calls of coyotes, the occasional howl of wolves, and the rustle of small animals moving through the grass. In forested regions, the sounds differed but shared the quality of reminding settlers of the wild nature that surrounded their small cleared spaces. The sense of vulnerability that darkness brought reinforced the isolation of frontier life and the dependence of families on their own resources and the protection of their homes. Sleep came to frontier families in beds that ranged from rope-supported frames with straw mattresses to simple pallets on the floor, covered by whatever blankets and quilts could be made or brought from the East. Winter nights required multiple layers of bedding and often the warmth of family members sleeping together, as the fire was allowed to die down overnight and temperatures inside the house dropped considerably. Summer brought different challenges, with heat and insects making comfortable sleep difficult without any means of cooling beyond opening doors and windows to catch whatever breeze might be moving.
The cycle of waking and sleeping, like all aspects of frontier life, reflected the basic realities of living in a challenging environment with minimal resources and technology. This pattern of daily life on the American frontier in the 19th century represented a transitional phase in the settlement of the continent, as families established themselves in regions that would eventually become fully integrated into the agricultural and commercial systems of the expanding nation. The hardships endured by these frontier settlers, from isolation and primitive living conditions to the back-breaking labor required to establish productive farms, gradually gave way to more comfortable circumstances as regions developed infrastructure, attracted more settlers, and connected to markets through improved transportation. Individual lives unfolded within this larger historical process, each person's daily activities contributing to the transformation of the frontier into settled territory. This simple, steady pattern of daily existence on the American frontier was an ordinary reality for the people who called these homesteads their home.